This is my presentation on borders and boundaries by me, Lucia. So, starting off with defined boundary, it's basically something that's formed through legal agreements. A great example is the border between the US and Canada, which can be seen in this image above right here, the Plato example. So, the black ones are the borders, and we can see that there's the border between the US and Canada, which were formed through multiple treaties, such as the Treaty of Paris. This can also be a great example for delimited boundary, which is something that's formally drawn on the map. And on the map, we can see this black border um, that's indicating the borders between these two countries. Next is demarcated boundary, which is basically a physical marker that's on the ground and that's physically showing the border. A great example is the Great Wall of China, which was physically built to protect the Chinese territories from the invaders. Next is natural boundary, which is basically about a border with naturally occurring features. A great example is the Rio Grande River, which has the naturally occurring feature, the river that's in between the border between Texas and a part of Mexico specifically. Next is the geometric boundary, which is the border drawn using straight lines or arch. We can see between Libya and Egypt, there's a black straight line that separates these borders or separates these countries, and it was established in the colonial era by the European powers. Next is the cultural boundary, which basically separates different cultural groups based on their language or religion or other parts. A great example is the Green Line in Cyprus. We can see that the black border over here separates the south, which are primarily the Turkish Cypriot, and the south, which is the Greek Cypriot, and this reflects the historical divisions and conflicts. The next one is the antecedent boundary, which is formed before the present population has emerged. And the border between the US and Canada is also a great example for this because the borders were established before the start of the westward expansion. Next is the relic boundary, and this is where the border no longer it physically exists, but it no longer does the job, and the border doesn't really prevent anything or separates. So it used to the Berlin Wall, for example, used to separate East and West Berlin, but right now it doesn't really does its job, and it's just physically there. A small portion of it is still remaining at the site. Next is the superimposed boundary, which is formed due to external forces. A great example is pretty much all of the African borders because they were formed and created by the colonial powers, by the Europeans. Next is the subsequent ethnographic boundary, and a great example of this is India and Pakistan, the border between these two, because we can see that India is mostly Hindus while Pakistan's are mostly Buddhists, and this reflects the distribution of different ethnic groups. Next is open boundary, which basically allows people and other resources to move freely without um, a lot of restrictions. A great example is the Schengen area, which basically the European Union's made like an agreement and like pact that they don't need passport or border controls within these borders. Next is the militarized boundary, which basically is guarded heavily by military forces. A great example is the Korean demilitarized zone, that which is the border between North and South Korea, and like the picture, the soldiers are holding guns, and they are a lot of military groups there trying to guard the border. Next is definitional dispute, and this is when there's a conflict in defining a boundary. A great example is between Israel and Palestine. So we can see on the image here, Israel, there's an ongoing dispute for the boundary between the West Bank, which is right here on the left side of Israel, and the Gaza Strip is on the left side of Israel, and the West Bank on the right side of Israel. Next is locational dispute, and this is conflict over precise placement. So an example is between India and China in the Himalayan region. So this is India, that's China, and this red part is the Aksai Chin area, which where there's a rising conflict. Next is operational dispute, and this is when there's a conflict over management of a boundary. Again, a great example is between the US and Mexico in regards to stuff like immigration or transport of goods. Next is allocation dispute, which is disagreement over resources that's located near the boundaries. A great example is the Nile River because countries near the Nile River are um, fighting over water rights and usages, especially between the upstream and downstream for fair share. Next is compact state, and this is when a territory is usually in a circular or square shape, and it has the capital in the center. And Poland is just a great example for it because it represents like it qualifies all these characteristics of a compact state. Next is the corrupted state, which is when a territory extends away from the main source. An example is the Democratic Republic of Congo because it's away from the long stretch of water. Next is the fragmented state, which literally is just having a bunch of separated territories. And an example of this is the Philippines because, as you can see in the image, there's a bunch of islands that's scattered around. Next is elongated state, which is basically a territory that's long and narrow. An example is Chile, which is this orange part here. It's narrow and it's skinny and long. Next is the perforated state, and this is when a territory is completely surrounding another state. An example is South Africa and Lesotho because, like the image here, South Africa, the green part is completely covering the red part, which is Lesotho, a completely different country. Next is territorial sea, and this is the area of water next to the coast, and this extends up to 12 nautical miles. An example is the Philippines trying to claim territorial sea in the South China Sea because it extends up to this 12 nautical miles. So the yellow part is the South China Sea, and the green is the Philippines, red's China, and they're having a conflict because the Philippines want to do fishing and like use the natural resources in this yellow part. Next is the contiguous zone, and this is near the territorial sea, but it extends up to 24 nautical miles. An example of this is the British Isles because over here, like the UK is trying to maintain and enforce like the customs and like immigrations and like environmental laws regarding to it, but and they're trying to have like better control of like their nation's security, but there's also tension between the British Isles because they have to compete for the resources and like have disagreements over enforcements. Next is the exclusive economic zone, which is also known as the EEZ, and this is also near the territorial sea, but this one extends up to 200 nautical miles. An example is Norway, which is the orange part here, trying to claim EEZ in the North Sea, which is the green part over here, and they're trying to manage the natural resources, but there's a dispute between like the neighboring countries like UK and Denmark for like resource allocations and the boundaries and setting up the boundaries. Next one is high sea, which is the area of ocean that does not belong to anyone. An example of this is the Pacific Ocean, which is like this empty space over here between the continents. And this is where all countries get to enjoy the freedom of doing whatever they want, like research, trading, or fishing. Um, so landlocked state is a territory that does not have access to ocean directly. An example of this is Paraguay, which is this yellow part over here, and it's surrounded by like places like Bolivia or like Argentina. Next is enclave, which is a portion of territory that's completely surrounded by a territory of a different country. An example again is South Africa, which is over here or here, and Lesotho is like completely covered by South Africa. Lastly, exclave is a portion of a territory that's being separated from the main part and it's completely surrounded by a territory of a different country. An example of this is the Kaliningrad Oblast, which is part of Russia, but it's between Poland and Lithuania and the Baltic Sea, and it's separated from the Russian mainland. Thank you.